with surrogacy, because I've been tapping into that a little bit lately. It's such a hot market, let's say, where, people, the advertising, like even the marketing is like, you have absolutely, as a surrogate, you have absolutely no connection to this child. And I'm like, that's impossible. If the amniotic fluid is actually forming the CSF of the baby, and if information is transmitted through this fluid, which we're learning more and more and more that it is, how is there no connection whatsoever? And it begs the question of who is the biological mother of this child. And I'm always putting polls into my memberships and my trainings with the doulas that I train. And, some people say, no, it's who gave the egg. No, it's who gestated the baby. No, it's both. There's two mothers, right? So it's kind of this existential question is emerging in my world, with this idea that amniotic fluid carries so much power in forming and transmitting life.
Oh, totally. Absolutely. There's no question about that. And, I mean, I believe there's even studies that have come out. I don't follow this as closely as some of the other studies I follow, but, there are, I believe there's maternal cells that are actually found in the baby and baby cells that are found in the mother. And there's this
microchimerism.
Yeah, that actually happens. Right. So that's number one. The other one is, like you said, like, the information, the forming from the fluid, before, as these cells differentiate, there's amniotic fluid, and then there's the yolk sac underneath. And as they differentiate, the amniotic fluid around all this is chorionic fluid, right? So as you are very early, if there's any concern, right, that's why chorionic sampling is done early on in pregnancy, and then amniotic fluid or amniocentesis is done later, because early on, if there's any concern or any sort of genetic issues or anything like that, you do you do a chorionic sampling, and that's because the cavity that the child it's not even a developing embryo yet. I mean, it is, but it's it's literally layers thick of cells. Around that is the chorionic cavity, and that's filled with chorionic fluid, and all that fluid is essentially coming from the mother. And then as the baby differentiates, and you get the amniotic fluid then becoming the cerebrospinal fluid, right? So in us, and this is actually something interesting, because you may have people in these states of deep meditation or during this healing work have an energetic connection to their embryonic state. And that energetic connection may actually be through the cerebrospinal fluid, again, as this sort of transmitter of information via and directly link into your amniotic fluid, because the amniotic fluid, right, differentiates into the cerebrospinal fluid. So as the cerebrospinal fluid is developing, there's this mix of amniotic fluid and cerebrospinal fluid for a period of time. And then as the fusion occurs and our brain gets fused, then there's a complete separation, but then more amniotic fluid starts to develop. And now we've sort of encased the cerebrospinal fluid inside what's called the neural tube that makes the cavities, the ventricles, and the central canal of the spinal cord. But there is, at the beginning of that, the amniotic fluid and the cerebrospinal fluid are essentially the same fluid. As differentiation occurs, right, now the cells and the choroid plexus, which is the tissue that makes a lot of the cerebrospinal fluid, comes into play, and it starts making more cerebrospinal fluid. The cerebrospinal fluid then starts differentiating from the amniotic fluid. As that starts to happen, the chorionic fluid starts to lessen, because the baby, now the fetus, actually starts increasing in size, and more amniotic fluid needs to be created so that the baby can be in this amniotic fluid, right? So later on in gestation, the baby's floating around in amniotic fluid. That's all the baby is, and it's almost impossible to get any chorionic fluid. But the reason I bring this up is because from a fluid perspective, right, the cerebrospinal fluid in us today has a homeopathic component of the amniotic fluid from when we were just 2 layers of cells thick, right? And that gets diluted as time goes on, but there's still, right, whether or not we look at it from a very, a vestigial amount of amniotic fluid or a homeopathic quantity, and that may even get more potent because, as some people know, the more something gets diluted in homeopathy, the more it actually might become more potent. And to hold that energy, to hold that information, people may have the experience of, as they're having a relationship with this fluid, that fluid is directly connected to the amniotic fluid in your mother's womb when you weren't even a fetus, when you were, just a couple layers thick of cells. And so that's also a good, even if there's any moments during any meditation or during any healing sessions of going back into the womb, that this fluid can actually be kind of like one of those mediums back to that, and then and still, but you're still embodied, right? You're still in this body here. And then even think of, right, the cerebrospinal fluid in the child that you're holding, which came from the fluid that you created, and that fluid that you created actually has a homeopathic quality of the amniotic fluid from when you were in the womb, right? So it's multi-generational then from that perspective. And you've absolutely, like, it's absolutely important, I think, to look at that and even if we don't know what to do with it, just honor it.